Yeah, so thanks for having me. So I should say first off that in terms of the time frame, while the title of this talk is has late antiquity in the title, in reality, you will see from my case studies that late antiquity is a bit of a stretch because we're actually a little bit earlier. And the reason is that I'm presenting here some ideas of a book that I'm currently working on. So this is really very much work in progress that I'm presenting. And so my book is on the role of the Danube in late antiquity. And I explore in this book questions of the extent to which the Danube was a frontier, the extent to which it was a communication route. And when I first began working on this, I thought, well, to be able to understand the Danube in late antiquity and then in the early medieval period, I must also understand the earlier periods. And then somehow I got more and more interested in earlier and earlier periods. And so there we are. So really what I'm starting with is actually firmly situated in the Roman period. But I hope, as you will see from my case studies, there is also a question mark over how we exactly define Roman and what that means in this context. Okay, so in this paper today, I'll just give you a few insights or highlights from the work that I've done so far. So I'm particularly interested in the role that the Danube had in mediating and facilitating the movement of people who lived along its banks. So the importance of river frontiers of the Roman world is something that's been very long understood. So if we just look at this map here, we can see very clearly how certainly in Northern Europe, Rhine and Danube formed the northern boundaries of the Roman Empire. In the east, the Euphrates played a similar role. But very often you see the rivers represented like they are here on this map. So they're just lines drawn on a map, and then shaded in gray is where the Roman world is, and then beyond that, the kind of blanker spots is where the non-Roman world is. But exactly what that meant, the physicality of the river does not really come out in maps like that. So I'm really interested in what life was like for people living along the riverbanks. First, when the Danube was still a frontier, and then in later centuries when it wasn't, but when the remains of that frontier was still present. Because if we take a deep time perspective, then we can see that the Danube throughout prehistory has been a great connecting artery between the Black Sea and then by extension also the Mediterranean, and then Central and Western Europe. So the Danube has always played a very important role in facilitating population movement, but also the movement of goods and ideas. And it was only at a much later point that it became then a kind of border. And this is really where my work starts, just questioning to the extent to which it was a border, what did that mean for people at the time, and to what extent was it still a communication route. So what was the Danube actually like? Well, first of all, we need to be clear that the environment of the Danube has changed very significantly since late antiquity and the early medieval period. Principally because pretty much the entire course of the Danube has been channelized since the 18th century. So these were big projects, so that the Habsburgs in particular were very instrumental in this. So they were big projects to get the Danube to be constrained into a single river channel. And so in large parts, certainly at of the upper and the middle Danube, what it looks like today is in no way what it looked like in the past. And so here on this slide are just some illustrations of the physicality of the river. So at the top left, you can see an ice jam in Serbia. These ice jams can be very, very powerful, and you can see here how they can really smash up everything that's in their way. They can even destroy bridges. And there are accounts in late Roman writings also of the significance of these ice jams. Then at the bottom, you can see this is a photo of flooding. So flooding is a repeated problem in the Danube. This is a problem that's become worse through the channelization. So that even though the purpose of it was to constrain the river to prevent flooding, in actual fact, the channelization has made things worse. And then on the right, there's a photo of a region that will become relevant in a little while. This is part of the inland delta of the Danube, which is now also mostly disappeared, but here's a nature reserve where you can see it's still in a more natural state. So I found that when thinking about human-river interactions, there are two concepts that are particularly helpful. So one is the kinetic energy of rivers, and we can see this really powerfully here in the photos of the ice jam and the flooding. So the kinetic energy is that becomes relevant for transport, but also for structures such as bridges and mills. There's also energy in a river for human consumption through the food, for example, that is provided by the animals living in and on the river. And then the other concept that I work with is the idea of rivers as socio-natural hybrids. And here I've had a lot of inspiration from sociologists. So the sociology or the anthropology of water is something that's become quite topical in recent years. And that's also been taken up by archaeologists. So one book that I found very helpful was the book by White called The Organic Machine, The Remaking of the Columbia River. And just to pull out just a phrase from that book, so he thinks of rivers as a hybrid shaped by the ways humans and nature act together to create new intermingled forms and processes. And then this is a concept that's been taken up by Matthew Edgeworth, who's an archaeologist who's written a book on the archaeology of flow. And he, quite similarly to White, speaks of an archaeology of flow as an approach to rivers that recognizes the dynamic entanglements of nature and culture. So central to these studies is really that both humans and rivers have agency, and any actions that humans carry out on the river, so for example, manipulations of river courses, then may have unintended consequences further down the line. And this is something that I'm going to illustrate in the examples that now follow. So I've got two, because there isn't a lot of time. I just want to focus on two examples really. So one is the formation of the Danube Delta, and then the second example, called Between Land and Water, focuses on the inland delta of the Danube. So more on that later. So the formation of the Danube Delta. Well, so here on this slide, you can see the full extent of the Danube watershed. So it's huge. The river is almost 3,000 kilometers long. And the delta is here marked in yellow. And so given the length and the extent of this watershed, it's really interesting that the delta in its present shape is only about 2,000 years old. Okay. And here we can see up close, Romanian colleagues have done a lot of work on the delta formation, Romanian geologists, that is. So here you can see an image of different episodes of delta formation. So if we just take a look at the image on the left, you have to kind of read the legend from bottom to top. So the green arms, the three Kilia arms, are the ones that are most recent. So Kilia 1, Kilia 2 and 3 in particular were formed about 1,000 to 300 years before present, and then Kilia 3 was formed around 300 years before present. So you can see these are really within very recent historic timescales. And then on the right, you can see a satellite image where you can see at present the three main branches of the river in the delta formation. And again, you can see the one, I hope you can see my mouse here, but the northern arm is the most recent one. But what is interesting for us is this southern arm, the St. George arm. And here I just want to draw your attention to the location of this place here called Histria. So Histria was a Greek colony on the shores of the Black Sea. It was founded in the mid-7th century before the Common Era, but it remained important throughout the Roman period and then into late antiquity. So we'll see for a minute what happened there. But first, some context to the delta formation. So how do deltas form? Well, deltas can only form through a process that's called aggregation. So increased sedimentation, increased sediment carried by the river is what extends the shape of the delta outwards into the sea. Okay, so the sediment has to come from somewhere. And the sediment in our case comes from deforestation that in turn leads to increased erosion. And you can see here on this map, so if you just particularly focus on Central and Western Europe, you can see really nicely the deforestation from 1000 BC to pretty much modern periods. Okay, and just take a particular look at the map on the middle left, AD 350, because here you can see really in great contrast to 300 BC, just how much deforestation has already happened. Okay, and this is deforestation that coincides with the Roman period. So deforestation for the purpose of building material, for the purpose of land clearance, for the purpose of fuel requirements. And then another factor that contributes to increased erosion is increased precipitation. And here also we have in the late antique period increased precipitation that coincides with the late antique Little Ice Age. So you can just see here precipitation totals marked in the blue wiggly lines up at the top. And you can see in particular around the 6th and 7th century, there is a big spike in precipitation. And so that together, increased erosion, increased precipitation has led to delta growth. So to go back to our delta and looking again at the Greek colony of Histria. So as I said, it was founded in the 7th century BC. It was part of a series of Greek colonies along the Black Sea shore. And then the city was abandoned by the 5th and 6th century of the Common Era, coinciding with the late antique Little Ice Age. And the reason being, so here on the left, you can see the Gulf of Halmyrus in 3000 BP, and then on the right, you can see it in its present state with date ranges given for different periods of sedimentation. And what's very clear is that sediment growth, delta growth here blocked off the port of Histria in the 5th and 6th century, forming a lagoon. And behind the lagoon, I mean, there was no secure harbor anymore for trade. And so effectively Histria lost its main function. And this, to me, is a really good example of the entanglement of humans and rivers, because the deforestation, which was brought about by Roman imperial expansion, caused erosion upstream, far, far upstream. And then this resulted in increased sediment transportation and deposition in the delta. And then this in turn cut off Istria from the Black Sea. So this is a case of unintended consequences, where human activities far upstream had an impact on the delta. So humans and the river together created this delta. Right, okay, so now moving to my second example, which is much more clearly focused on mobility. So where are we? So here we are in the region of the Danube inland delta, which I've just marked here on this topographic map to orientate yourselves. We are between Bratislava and Budapest. The blue area is an area of low-lying ground that prior to channelization was very swampy, and it's now fully drained. So in the present, you can't really recognize it at all as a delta anymore. But we still have a glimpse of what life was like in this area from a description of a traveler, an Italian traveler who traveled along the entire length of the Danube in the early 18th century. And from him, we have a whole range of really interesting descriptions and a travel log. So here, he describes this area as follows. So he says, the greater and lesser Schicht islands, so you can see the islands being formed by arms of the river, as they are commonly called, are like islands of deception or a kind of labyrinth, because they are completely flooded like marshes. Those making a path through them are prone easily to lose the correct way. So it's very clear that this was a watery landscape where the boundaries of land and water were not very clear. So what did that mean for the location of the Roman frontier? So in this case, there was no one defined river channel that could provide a boundary between the Roman world and the non-Roman world. So how and where was this boundary imagined? So I want to get a little bit towards how, well, the role really of the river, of the landscape in people's imagination through this example here. So this is the so-called King's Grave of Murzov in modern day Moravia. The chronological context here is the Marcomannic Wars, so the second half of the 2nd century CE. And we are here formally outside of the Roman Empire, but the material culture and the architecture here tell a very different story. The site was discovered in 1988. So there's actually there's a bigger complex of this site, but I just specifically want to focus on the chamber grave of the so-called King's Grave. And that was discovered in 1988. It was a burial chamber constructed out of wood and stone. And there were a very significant number of objects that were recovered here, as well as also the remains of 3 skeletons, 2 males, 1 female, and some animal bones. Okay. So the objects in this chamber grave were really spectacular. So there were a number of heirloom objects. So there was silverware of Augustan date, so predating the chamber grave by more than 100 years. Then there was an Iron Age fire dog. Then on the right, you can see a folding table. Then the objects in the chamber indicate connection with the Roman military milieu. So we can see that through the strap ends, belt buckles, and the lance with the silver inlay and also horse ornamentation down at the bottom right. And as well as this, there was an exceptional collection of silver and bronze vessels, also bronze lamp, a bronze offering table, a spatula probe, a number of Roman pottery and glass vessels, and some absolutely splendid bronze vessels, which you can see here. So this is the burial chamber as it was excavated, and I just want to draw your attention to this big object in the middle, which was a bronze cauldron. Okay, and then here we are close up. So the bronze cauldron on its four sides was decorated with a bust of a man with a very, very distinctive hairstyle. So this grave really raises some very complicated questions for us. So it's clearly, it's in some form exists here within the Roman military milieu. It was a chamber grave. There were objects that were distinctly local, so not strictly. So this was not a grave purely in the Roman tradition. It was a grave also in the local tradition. So we have to ask ourselves, who was the person who was buried here, and why was he represented in this way? And then in addition, there is this question of what is the meaning of this object? So if we take a closer look at this cauldron, and in particular the representation on it, well, just take a quick note of the hairstyle. Okay, this hairstyle is what's been called the Swabian knot. So it's a very recognizable hairstyle of populations in the non-Roman world. So it comes up, for example, has been found on the so-called Osserby head. So this was a bog body that was found in Schleswig-Holstein and has been carbon dated to 70 to 130 CE. And there are also quite a small number, but significant number of similar objects, such as, for example, the one in the center, the Charnovko cauldron, which is located at number 13 on the map. So that was found in Poland. Very similar object, again with the bust of a person on a bronze cauldron. Similar, but not identical, if we just go back here, because this cauldron here was manufactured within a Roman context. The artistic tradition, the representation of individuals was very, very clearly within the Roman context, especially because we don't, at the same time, in the same time period, have a tradition of portraiture like this. So this is very, very clearly within the Roman world. And that raises the question of what was the meaning of this representation, because we do have representations of local individuals, non-Roman local individuals, often in a subjugated context. So the emperor has his neck on the barbarians, has his foot on the neck of the barbarians, for example. But in this case, this was a high status grave, and this is not a representation of a subjugated population. So was the cauldron commissioned specifically? Was it given as a gift from within the Roman world? Was it a diplomatic gift? And then also, what did local people think of this representation? A representation that they must have been quite familiar with, with their local hairstyles. And I'm afraid I don't have any really clear answers, but I think there is something in the hybridity of this object that already gives us a route into how we should understand it, because the object in some ways defies classification, and I think this is really significant here. Okay, and now just to conclude, just to give you a bit more context of the situation that we're in. So now we're a little bit later, we're in the first half of the 3rd century. And here you can see the extent to which this region was tied in with Roman mass-produced pottery and trade routes. So the black squares on the map are the locations of Roman legionary fortifications. And then the red dots are locations of where terra sigillata or Samian ware was found. So in what ways can we imagine that the river here played a role? So was this undefined area of land and water and of undefined boundaries also undefined in terms of whether it was or wasn't part of the Roman world? And did the absence of a river-Rhine boundary contribute to this slightly strange land, this slightly strange cultural environment where you could be both inside and outside the Roman world, where you could be a barbarian, but you were represented on Roman bronze vessels? So in these just very brief examples, I tried to sketch a picture of the way in which the Danube was a lived landscape, and as a lived landscape, it played a role in shaping people's lives and also in shaping people's perceptions of their lives. The first example took us to the grand scale, so erosion causing delta growth. And then the second example was a much more intimate one, connecting the mind and the environment. And I attempted to draw out how relationships between people could be shaped by the possibility of the connections afforded by the river. And so here again, you just see the contrasting images of the very static, line on the map, and then really the reality of an environment that was very complicated. So I'll stop here. Thank you.